Good evening. My name is Ted Landsmark. I am a professor of public policy within the School of Public Policy at Northeastern University, and you have tuned into the Myra Kraft Open Classroom, which this semester is focusing on power to the people, ways of engaging community voices in urban decision-making. We have a quite exceptional panel this evening, and we're going to be talking about engaging farm workers and farm worker communities in decision-making. Because of the subject matter, we are also having translation services available. And so I am going to turn the screen over to our translators to talk briefly about the process for connecting to our conversations in Spanish.
Muy buenas tardes a todos, o quizás días, en donde sea que estén. Esta junta tiene interpretación simultánea en el lenguaje de español. Para poder acceder a la interpretación, si usted está por computadora, buscará el icono de un mundo que aparece abajo de su pantalla, seleccionará español y los invitamos a silenciar el audio original. De esa manera no está escuchando dos voces. Si usted está por tableta o por teléfono, el proceso es diferente. Seleccionará los 3 puntos que aparecen en su pantalla. Luego seleccionarán interpretación, después seleccionarán español. Una vez más, los invitamos a silenciar el audio original y cuando han acabado, arriba de su pantalla habrá un botón que dice listo o done. Selecciónenlo y deberían de estar en el canal. Would you like me to also give the instructions in English?
Yes.
Very well. So for all of our monolingual English speakers, please select the interpretation icon that appears at the bottom of your screen. And also we invite you to not silence your original audio. That way, if you are having audio problems, you'll be able to hear everything. And this just allows you to hear any comments made in Spanish interpreted directly into English simultaneously. And again, if you are by phone or by tablet, the process is different. You go into the more option on your phone or tablet, and then you'll select language interpretation, and then select English, and you should be able to hear the interpreter whenever somebody speaks in Spanish. And this will definitely make sure that we have language access for all. Thank you so much.
I have some fairly considerable experience with multilingual presentations, and my one piece of advice to all is that if we are going too fast or getting into areas where there's a need for further explanation, please jump into the chat, let us know so that we can make sure that we don't lose touch with any of our audience. And with that said, I will turn the screen over to my colleague, Rebecca Riccio.
Thank you so much, Ted. Hello, everyone who is tuning in, and enormous thanks to our panelists who are joining us tonight, the interpreting team, our tech team, and to my friend and colleague, Becca Berkey, who is going to be leading the conversation tonight. I have had the pleasure of working with Becca in her capacity as the Director for Community Engaged Teaching and Research at Northeastern. Many people on campus know her for her insightful work in this space as a scholar and as a program coordinator for many of us who do service learning and other aspects of community engaged teaching and research. But tonight, I'm delighted to be engaging with Becca in another capacity. She is also a scholar in food systems with a deep understanding and long time collaboration with many members of the farm working community, and has brought together a great group of people for us to learn from and with this evening. And so with that, I am going to hand things over to Becca. I'll make one last comment. I think it's important to mention, I don't want to forget this. We started the open classroom this semester with an introduction of our newly launched principles of anti-oppressive community engaged teaching and research for university educators and researchers. And Becca has been an incredible voice in that process. And I consider her to be, along with Jordana McHagney, one of the stewards of that process here on campus. And tonight also represents some of the ideas and values that have come out of that process as well. So Becca, thank you so much. And I'm going to hand it over to you to see us through this evening.
Thank you both so much. I'm just honored to be here and really, really looking forward to this. So I am going to share my screen quickly and I will explain what is on it here in a minute. Let me just do that. Share. All right. So I've prepared my comments so that I stay within time and really cede the time as much as possible to the amazing folks that are joining us this evening. So just forgive me, I'm going to be reading a bit, but probably editorializing as well. So I just want to say hello to everyone. A huge, huge thank you to Rebecca, Ted, and your whole team for having us here this evening to discuss with you collaborative research that has been happening and continues to happen around health and safety issues that farm workers in the US specifically are facing. I do want to acknowledge that throughout my remarks that I'm going to be giving to kind of open us up this evening, I am going to be forwarding through some of these slides, which hopefully you can see on your screen. Just to give you all the context of the community that we'll be discussing and engaging with tonight, knowing that not everyone shares the same vision when we hear the word farm worker. You'll see more photos without text later on during one of our presenters' opening introductory comments, again, that serve the same purpose. And I just want to acknowledge that these photos were generously provided by the Farmworker Association, which you'll hear more about tonight. These are such challenging times that we're living in, and I want to acknowledge the depth of what we're all carrying as we come into this space tonight. Our discussion really centers on people who are, by virtue of their labor, victimized by the same tidal waves created by capitalism that we see reflected in ongoing partisan divides, our global pandemic, a climate that's at the point of no return, it feels, war and conflict, and the very real impacts on the ground in families and amongst communities of all these ongoing tragedies. Farm workers are people who live by virtue of their intersecting marginal identities in the eye of the storm and who are themselves a community. In a letter to the Environmental Protection Agency, responding to their draft of the Environmental Justice 2020 Action Agenda Framework, Jeannie Economos, one of tonight's panelists stated, farm workers are a special and often overlooked environmental justice community because farm workers comprise a community that's defined by their occupation and in general, oftentimes by their mobility and their rural demographics. They are not often included in the prevailing discussions around environmental justice. Farm workers are a community that spans the entire country, wherever they go to perform the important agricultural work that this country and their livelihoods depend upon. Yet, farm workers are a community because of their common experiences, interests, concerns, and exposures, most notably their exposures to pesticides in the workplace and through drift and or take-home exposures in their home environments. Tonight's panel is one that honors both the intersecting injustices that farm workers in the United States face, but also one that represents what can happen when community members are engaged as researchers and as researchers step back to support, uplift, and use their power and access in deference to community goals and wishes. The people that you'll hear from, whom I'm incredibly honored to introduce to you tonight, to my Northeastern community, really embody that possibility. For those who don't know me, I am just so pleased to have the chance to meet you. My primary role, as Rebecca said, is catalyzing and supporting, along with my amazing team, community engaged teaching and research across the university. However, while that's the primary role in a landscape within which I've spent much of my professional life, I'm also an activist researcher, an environmental sociologist by academic training, and have actively since 2008 been channeling my energy in that part of my identity and ethos to examining justice-related issues regarding labor in our food system, specifically on farms in the US. My passion for this is a long story, but it's worth noting that it was inspired by my time in the community, partnering with the Farmworker Association of Florida, a state where I lived in some of my formative years as a person, a human, an academic, and where I learned, not in a class, but in the field itself, what environmental justice was, something that I'd long felt passionately about, but didn't have terminology or theories for understanding. As Rebecca mentioned, we were asked to, in framing out our presentations, really consider the principles of anti-oppressive community engagement. And while I think you'll see many of them reflected in tonight's comments and conversation, there are three in particular that I want you to be kind of listening for. And one of those is honoring communities' autonomy and right to self-determination. I think that you'll see that reflected quite a bit in the conversations that you'll hear tonight. Another being building authentic, mutually beneficial relationships with patience and humility. So listening for where you see that being reflected. And finally, managing resources equitably and recognizing that control of those resources is a form of power, and that we have to sit with that and really think about how we can, even with the best of intentions, often perpetuate inequity in our relationships with communities and community partners. And I think tonight's examples are people who have really navigated that and come through to really think about equitable ways of managing those resources. So tonight we welcome the following people to our Northeastern community: Maria Carmona, Immokalee Area Coordinator and Organizer at the Farmworker Association of Florida; Jeannie Economos, the Coordinator of Pesticide Safety and the Environmental Health Program at the Farmworker Association of Florida; Joan D Flux, the Director of the Social Policy Division Center for Governmental Responsibility and affiliate faculty in the Center for Latin American Studies at the University of Florida Levin School of Law; Joseph Gravatz, the Norjean Hendrickson Professor at Florida State University in the College of Health and Human Sciences; and Benita Lozano, the paralegal for the Migrant Unit of Florida Rural Legal Services and a member of the Farmworker Association of Florida Board of Directors. Because we have such a limited time together, Jeannie, who co-organized tonight with me and is also one of tonight's panelists, we have given everyone questions to consider in advance to weave into their fuller introductions, so we're able to kind of dive right in. So what you're going to hear from each person is going to be kind of a combo introduction to their work and pondering of some of these questions that we've posed to them. So just to kind of give you a sense of that format. So I will introduce the speakers in the order that we've all kind of agreed on, and keep time during their opening introductions and comments. And then I will let everyone here kind of know as we're moving between them. So I'll speak briefly in between each one to let you all know the framing questions we've given them to address. So the hope is that in doing this, we'll have some time, I know an hour goes really quickly, after they've each spoken, to address any questions or comments they have for one another, and or any that have emerged through the question and answer from the audience. Our interpreters tonight, Linguistica, interpretation and translation, is on hand to translate, as we discussed and introduced earlier in the session. And so if you have any questions about that, feel free to message anyone. So with that being said, I am going to go ahead and introduce our first speaker. And so hopefully you all have been taking in some of these images. So our first panelist to go tonight is going to be Joan D Flux. We've asked her to introduce herself and the type of work she does with the farm worker community, give us a sense of how she got involved with this work, her approach to it, how she goes about reaching out to community-based groups for research projects, and then any sort of examples that are good or maybe not so good about university and farm worker community research collaboration. So Joan, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, and I can drive the slides if you just tell me when you want me to forward them.
Okay, thanks. Just as you were ending that introduction, my sound started going wonky. So I think if it gets bad, you're going to have to tell me verbally, because I've got a couple screens going on here. So, but thank you for inviting me here. I'm happy to discuss my experiences with community engaged research with farm worker communities. I am research faculty at the UF, as you mentioned, and I've worked with immigrant communities in Florida for about 35 years in various roles as a social services lawyer, and most recently as a researcher. Next slide. Next slide. Thanks. I began working with farm worker communities in 1987 while working as a social services center in Indiantown, Florida, and doing research for my master's thesis in Latin American studies. The community there where I worked was multi-ethnic, The workers were of Haitian, Mexican, and Guatemalan Mayan origin. And my research involved visual ethnography. Then after completing my master's degree, I attended law school and worked in legal services. But I always hoped to get back to working with immigrant communities. And I eventually did when I came back to the University of Florida to work as a project manager for an NIEHS, which is a National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences community-based participatory research project in 1997. By then, I had already met and worked with organizers at the Farmworker Association on immigration and housing matters while I was still working in legal services. Next slide. The first NIEHS project that I worked on with the Farmworker Association was the Together for Agricultural Safety project. And that project focused on pesticide exposure in nursery and fernery industries in Central Florida. And this was the first of many academic community collaborative projects that I've been involved with. This is a list of some from 1997 to 2013. And the other side here is the interventions that we developed from some of these projects. And I know that that's tiny print and may be difficult to see. Next slide. And then next slide, Becca. Thanks. These are more recent projects that we've worked on together since 2014. And some of these projects have been with Emory University and the Farmworker Association. And then I've worked as a consultant on these projects. And then finally, we have projects that we are working on at the Southeastern Coastal Center for Agricultural Health and Safety, which I helped found. And a lot of those research projects and pilot projects are also focused on farm worker health and safety issues. And that's all that we have listed on this slide. And you'll hear about some of these projects maybe from the other speakers tonight, because they've all worked on many of these projects. So going back to the first project that I worked on in the very early days of federally funded community-based participatory research and environmental justice projects, I feel very fortunate to have worked been part of the family of those early NIEHS projects. But there was a lot of working out things in those days because when projects would come together at the annual conference that NIEHS sponsored every year for all the projects, the EJ projects and the community-based projects they were funding, there was a lot of dialogue, some of it very heated, about how academic researchers and communities could work together in a productive way and still get what all the partners needed out of the research. And out of that heated debate, sometimes very contentious, there were many articles published about guiding principles for community engaged research and best principles for community engaged research. And here I've just summarized some of the guiding principles from a couple of different articles for you. It won't take precious minutes in reading them, but I did want to present those. During that time, I got to see good examples and bad examples of effective academic community partnerships. And I think the most successful ones were those where the academic researchers had worked extensively with communities before they even thought about applying for research funding. It was important because that was the way that researchers established trust with communities. Academic researchers also had to understand the difference between academic research needs and community-based organizations needs, and importantly, between the difference between process and data outcomes. That kind of describes what each partner wants, from that partnership. Academic researchers had to have the ability to be able to sit through community meetings. They had to have the ability to listen. but never to speak for a community unless they were asked to do so. And these seems like very basic principles, but you'd be surprised how difficult they are for a lot of academic researchers to do, because that's not something that they're accustomed to doing. You asked me for examples of not so good collaborations, and they were mostly short-lived, first of all. And I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about bad examples, but I can tell you one of the most inappropriate comments from an academic researcher I ever heard in terms of community-based organizations is, well, if there is no community-based organization around, you can just create one yourself. And I've always carried that with me as, you know, a bad example of an academic researcher attempting to do community-engaged research. Next slide. Becca, if I'm running out of time, just give me a wave, because I can't see the chat right now. So yeah, 1 minute. Okay. Several years ago, the partners from the Emory team and the Farmworker Association, we kind of engaged in this internal lessons learned survey, not as a formal evaluation of any projects, but kind of just to identify strengths and weaknesses of our projects. That's what these conclusions are for. I think what's really important about these points that came out of that internal assessment was the sense of how over time the Farmworker Association developed the capacity to participate in community engaged research. And you could really see the evolution of that from the first project to the last project. And by the third project, the team was very much in a collaborative decision-making and action model. The difference between the last project and the first one was that there was less time needed to establish mutual respect, because the partners were able to build on each collaborative experience that they had. And I think that really reveals the importance of capacity building as part of the community engaged research process. And then final slide. Just finally, in conclusion, I just want to leave you with a quote from one of the community partners. One of the research partners in our partnership, who says that even after years of working together, you still have individual lens on a situation. It doesn't merge into one collective that sees the same way. And that you should never, ever take the other for granted, but just be grateful for the opportunity to collaborate and work together to show how the process works. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Joan, for those really provocative comments and examples. And I see so many connections to, I think, the principles that are framing this whole open classroom, both tonight, but this whole semester. So I really appreciate you being here and sharing that with us. Next, we're going to hear from Jo Gravatz. And what we've asked Jo to prepare is also an introduction, but really thinking about work that he's done with farm workers in both North Carolina and Florida, and kind of comparing and contrasting approaches and results in different experiences. And then also farm workers and workers in different sectors and different communities, and really kind of what are the sort of, I guess, universal truths that we might see kind of across different sorts of community work, and then the things that you really have to take into consideration of being different and really kind of taking that approach of learning. And so, Jo, I will go ahead and turn it over to you.
Excellent. Thanks so much for that, Becca. I have to say that I always hate going after Joan, because she's always so prepared and she always has such polished sorts of materials. And by contrast, I'm just sort of a by the seat of my pants kind of guy. I guess that's, I am the youngest of 3 children, so I've got the perpetual youngest child syndrome, and I just assume people are going to take care of me. But nevertheless, just like Joan, I'm thrilled to be here and to be part of this panel and in this discussion. So I've been doing, I'm sort of second generation. Joan's been doing farm worker work for 35 years. I've been doing it now for just a little over 20 years. And I began that work in North Carolina. Now, some of the fundamental elements that I think are important to the first question that you asked for me to think about or to comment on is to be attentive to the diversity of the farm worker population. When I cut my teeth, so to speak, on farm worker health and related research, it was in North Carolina. And by far the dominant crop in North Carolina is tobacco, right? So the vast majority of the work is done in the tobacco fields. The vast majority of farm workers that come in are working primarily in tobacco with a little bit of work in other commodities like onions and the sweet potatoes and perhaps some blueberries. But then by contrast, down here in Florida and frankly, North Georgia, right? So I could actually talk about farm worker work in 4 different states rather than 2 different states. But the sheer nature of the local economy and the local crops that are grown has a heavy influence, not only in the kind of workers that are coming in, but also the kinds of exposures that you have. So for example, Becca put up a nice picture of, back in the days when Florida was known primarily for its citrus, and of course it still is known for its citrus operations. But over the course of the last 20 years, with all the hurricanes that have gone through, the citrus industry is not what it once was. And a lot of farm workers now are working in more specialized, handheld kinds of crops. Think tomatoes, think eggplant, think the very small ornamental fruits and vegetables that people like to pick up at their local grocery store. Those things are very difficult to come up with mass harvesting kinds of operations for. And so it requires much more hand labor in terms of being able to get those things accomplished. And so one of the key items that I would really encourage the audience to recognize is, one of the things that I can speak to very concretely is across the 4 different states that I've worked with farm workers and farm worker health, is the vast array of different kinds of agricultural commodities that farm workers are engaged in. And each one of those commodities brings a different set of hazards. Pesticides are always there. When you're in the South, heat is always going to be there. But in some circumstances, there's going to be the hazards of mechanical equipment. In other circumstances, there's going to be the hazards of livestock and animal husbandry. And then in other circumstances, it's going to be, poisonous wild animals, think snakes, think scorpions, things of the sort. So there's always a wide variety of different exposures that farm workers confront. And those are going to be regionally dictated in some way, shape, or form. The second thing that really separates North Carolina from Florida in terms of farm worker things is I frankly didn't realize how spoiled farm workers are in North Carolina relative to farm workers in Florida. So, both are Southern right to work states, right? So there's relatively little opportunity, although we'll hear some success with regard to organized labor, but there's relatively low penetration of organized labor in both states. But North Carolina somehow, by hook or by crook, actually created a fairly well-established network of migrant centers that were actually operating in conjunction with one another that Florida would love to have. We would love to mimic something like the North Carolina Farm Workers Health Network, but we don't have anything like that, in part because we don't have the state infrastructure and the motivation on the part of policy or on the part of policymakers to actually facilitate and enable some of those connections, as they've been able to do in other states like North Carolina. And that really shows up quite concretely with things like the recent COVID pandemic, right? There's a reason why Florida had to invite the Centers for Disease Control into Florida to help combat the COVID-19 crisis, because we didn't have a centralized plan for being able to respond to the farm worker community. By contrast, in North Carolina, again, I'm not saying things are great in North Carolina, but relatively speaking, the impact was much less because there was a very centralized, organized way of getting ideas out to the farm workers throughout the state, but especially in the eastern part of the state where farm workers are concentrated most heavily in North Carolina. Further on top of that, though, is also the healthcare infrastructure more directly. And again, because it's orchestrated through the Office of Rural Health in North Carolina, there's some sense of oversight. And again, we've got some of it, and perhaps Jeannie will be talking about some of it in her remarks later on. But in Florida, it's a much more piecemeal system in terms of the kinds of outreach opportunities that are available in terms of serving the farm worker community. It's hit or miss in the Florida migrant communities, Florida migrant health centers, whether or not there's even an outreach component, much less the kinds of topics that they take on in that outreach component. So those are two very concrete examples of how the states are very different from one another. And I would argue, at the risk of being overly radical, I would argue that it's largely a function of how much the state actually wants to engage with the agricultural sector in terms of ensuring the health and safety of its workforce. Now, the last few comments that I want to talk about is Becca asked me to spend a little bit of time talking about, well, is farm work really all that different? What similarities and what differences do we see across different occupational sectors? To be clear, I've only had the opportunity to work in 3 different occupational sectors. So I've worked in the manufacturing sector. When I was in North Carolina, we had a couple of projects that focused on poultry processing, which technically falls in the manufacturing sector. Then I currently run and have historically run some projects in the construction sector. And then lastly, I've been doing farm work now for almost 20 years. And quite honestly, across those different sectors, there is substantial overlap in terms of the challenges confronted by immigrants in each of those situations. And every single one of them, what can you conceptualize is what they share. One thing that you conceptualized is decentralized workforce, with the exception of the poultry processing plants. But even in the poultry processing plants, because it's set up on sort of a conveyor belt kind of a system, there's really little opportunity for people at the front end of the line to talk with people at the back end of the line with regard to the things that are going on. And so one thing that all of those immigrant heavy sectors share is this largely decentralized, no explicit workplace kind of an arrangement. As I've heard several people talk about it, it's sort of like the Badlands, if you will, or the Wild West, in terms of the workers are really at sort of the expense of the crew leaders, the owners, operators, and to whatever extent they're willing to actually look out for the individuals who are under their charge. A parallel part, and I was just talking with folks about it just this morning, and a parallel part that shares or that covers each of those sectors is the general lack of representation or voice for workers in each of those sectors. Now here, this is a place where farm workers actually have great advantage. We've got things like the Farmworker Association of Florida. We've got the Coalition for Immokalee Workers. And if we go to other parts of the country, we'll see very similar kinds of farm worker advocacy kinds of groups. But in other sectors of the economy, we don't see those same things. So the construction project that I was mentioning just a few moments ago, that's currently taking place in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And one of the points that we're running into is Tulsa is a new settlement community. So it's grown about 500% over the course of the last decade. It is actually on the heels of 3 waves of immigration. The first wave of immigration was immigrants from South America who were largely educated and arrived to Tulsa to complete petroleum engineering degrees because it was the hub of the oil and gas industry. And like most people, they come to college, they decided that they liked it there, and they settled out and they got jobs in that area. But then the second wave of immigration was largely undocumented rural folks from Mexico and Central America. And who did the community turn to help them embrace that second wave? Of course, all the Spanish-speaking South Americans who frankly don't like Mexicans and Central Americans. And so on top of the racial tension that may have existed between whites and Latinos in general, there was also the Latino within Latino, perhaps classism kinds of challenges that perpetuated the difficulties of trying to receive that very large and rapidly growing Mexican Latino population. And I share that from the point of view of, if you look around in the peer-reviewed literature with regard to how do we actually do occupational safety and health in a community-based way, the only places that it's been done is agriculture, and we've got great examples that Joan has just talked about and others. But then the only other examples that exist are in Boston and in California. Now, what do those places have that places like Tulsa does not have? The answer to that question is they have longer standing immigrant communities that have infrastructure built into them, that have 501c3 organizations that actually have legs underneath them that can actually partner with an academic organization to try to facilitate some kind of change. In a place like Tulsa, Oklahoma, there is literally nothing like that. There is no workers center. There are no unions. There's a few 501c organizations that maybe hand out a scholarship to a Mexican American to go to college or something along that line. But there's no strong centralized advocacy in any way, shape, or form. And on top of it, it occurs in a context that had the strongest anti-immigrant sentiments with House Bill 1804, which was published, I think it was in 2012 or 2015, whatever it was. So I put that out again to bring back, what do farm workers and construction workers and poultry processing workers, what do they share? They share a lot. They come because they want to make money. They want to be able to earn a living for their families. They want to give their kids the opportunity to do things that they didn't have to do, and they're fulfilling a valuable service to the overall economy. But how do they differ from other parts of the economy? They work in a largely decentralized, relatively unsupervised kind of a workforce that's oftentimes outdoors, that creates this kind of no man's land, Wild West kind of an arrangement. And outside of a few large urban areas, there's relatively little infrastructure to be able to help support those communities in protecting themselves in the work that they do and advocating for themselves to create protections for them in addition to that. And then I'll stop there because I think I've answered all of my questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Joe. That was really, I think, provocative in the way that you tied it back into how and where we see this represented, both geographically, but also in the literature, right? I think is really something that I'm going to be pondering for quite a while. So thank you for that. Next, we're going to turn it over to Maria and Benita to talk a little bit, again, in an introductory way about who you are. Tell us about the work that you have done while you've been involved in community-based research projects. Really kind of thinking about how you approached outreach and communication and trust, building trust to enroll people in projects. And then the other questions that we've asked them to think about ahead of time is really what it's meant to farm worker community members and what they've learned. And maybe how they've benefited or not from participating in research partnerships like the ones that Joan and Joe have described. So Maria and Benita, I am going to turn it over to you.
Gracias, buenas tardes. Yo soy María Carmona, trabajo en la Asociación Campesina, tengo más de 13 años trabajando en la Asociación Campesina. Mi historia con los trabajadores del campo empezó en el 2008. Empecé trabajando en proyectos relacionados con la salud de la mujer campesina, hablándoles acerca de cuidado prenatal y ese tipo de cosas de cuidados. Trabajé en el proyecto de Bebé Te Amo, como ya lo dije, salud prenatal. Trabajé en el proyecto de los girasoles, en otro de salud mental. Mi relación con ellos en este tipo de proyectos ha sido como outreach, buscando a la gente, haciendo el alcance con la comunidad, como los contacto, como somos un pueblo pequeño, tengo esa ventaja de que la mayoría nos conocemos y el tiempo que ya tengo trabajando con la asociación, tengo una relación directa con los trabajadores del campo. Entonces, muchos ya nos conocen, conocen nuestro trabajo, confían en nosotros, hablamos con ellos acerca del proyecto. Algunas veces sí es un poco difícil porque por su trabajo no tienen el tiempo, pero cuando ya les hablamos de que hay un incentivo, un gift card, una tarjeta que probablemente no sea una cantidad muy grande, pero para ellos significa mucho, porque ellos dentro de los problemas que ellos tienen son el salario, que tienen muy bajos salarios, entonces un gift card de $20, $30 para ellos es mucho, para ellos es mucho. Esa es la manera en que yo me involucro con ellos, como yo hago la comunicación y hago la confianza para invitarlos a participar en los proyectos. ¿Qué ha significado para los miembros de la comunidad agrícolas? Yo pienso que principalmente se benefician al recibir esos gift cards. Otra de las cosas es como no tienen el acceso a la salud, cuando hacen esos proyectos que a veces es otra manera de que yo me envuelvo con ellos y les hablo acerca de la salud. Entonces cuando les hacen como pequeños físicos que les sacan sangre, toman muestras de orina, para ellos significa como que si fueran a un doctor. Entonces ese es uno de los beneficios que yo veo que ellos obtienen de este tipo de investigaciones. Otra de las cosas es que tienen un poco de educación, se enteran de la información que se les da acerca con estos proyectos y que, pues sí, eso, básicamente eso. ¿Qué ha significado para mí? Para mí significa tener la esperanza y seguir en la lucha de mejorar una calidad de vida para los trabajadores del campo, porque ellos tienen muchas carencias, son como un sector que son como explotados porque no tienen derechos, no tienen acceso a la salud, no tienen beneficios, entonces es como un sector casi como invisible, como si no existieran. Entonces, para mí es una satisfacción pues tratar o al menos seguir en esa lucha, en esa constante lucha de querer mejorar la calidad de vida de los trabajadores del campo.
Hola, yo soy Benita Lozano. I'm going to do this in English, prefiero, because it's easier for me. Otherwise, it's Spanglish. Okay, so I'm working with Florida Rural Legal Services right now, and we help the farm workers with immigration issues, fraud of salary, discrimination at work, human trafficking, and we also work with H-2A workers. Before working with Florida Rural Legal Services, I was working with Farmworkers Association of Florida, doing the health stress trainings, as well as pesticide trainings. And along doing that, I was able to also do research on the health and mental health of farm workers out in the field with the University of Florida. So it was a really good experience to see what type of needs were out there for the community and to see how little resources they actually had. So doing these researches with the universities is helpful because then we can find other resources within our area where we can actually benefit the community. Even though I don't work with farm workers anymore, I am part of their monthly meetings that they have here within our community. So within that monthly meetings, I was able to actually build relationships with the community and get to know them a little bit better. And that's how I was able to have their trust on my side and able for them to, confide in me with their stories or with their questions. But the one thing that I've noticed is that there were needed resources. And the more that we educate them, the better equipped they are to understand that we're here to help them. We're here to want to find justice for them. And we're here to make sure that they're being treated fairly at work because they don't get paid that much. So it's really good to know that they have people like Maria, Joe, and Joan, they're looking out for their rights, and being there available to them. Now, what has it taught me is to be engaged with my community. I've lived here my whole life, and up until 2020 is when I actually really got involved within my community. And it's let me see that there's a big need out here for us just to find the resources. Where do they apply for food stamps? Where can they go and get free health screenings? It's really nice to know that we are able to help our communities. And I'm grateful to be part of this panel because I'm getting to see that, it's not just a little voice, it's a big voice. It's a big voice that we're really doing for the community. And I think that's one thing that the community is happy with is that we are their voice and we value their time. So I thank you so much for letting me be a part of this tonight. Thank you.
Thank you both so much for sharing your experiences, your insights, and yeah, just in general for being here. And just, yeah, very grateful for that. So next up and last but not least, for our formal kind of introductory opening remarks, although I see the time, and so what are opening remarks when you're getting close to the hour, but that's okay. I am really honored to turn it over to Jeannie Economos. And I know everyone on this panel is here because we are connected to Jeannie. And Jeannie, to know Jeannie is to know someone who has a deep passion for social justice and farm workers specifically. I've known Jeannie for probably about 15 years as I've, really, I mean, she is the person who introduced me to the term environmental justice when I mentioned earlier that I didn't learn it in a class. So I'm really excited to have her here. So Jeannie, will have you introduce yourself. I will pull the slides back up and show some more of the pictures while you're talking as you've requested. And then really want to hear from you. And again, as the co-convener tonight and bringing these folks together, really giving more of that context and bringing the loop full circle around, how what farm workers experience in the US is tied to broader issues of systemic racial and social injustice, how you situate kind of navigating and facilitating all of these partnerships and dialogues kind of within a radical framework. And then what are the opportunities and the risks that are associated from your perspective, having been engaged in this work a long time as kind of the bridge in a lot of ways with university community research partnerships that are really aimed at creating social change toward justice for farm workers. So I will start screen sharing again and mute myself and show your pictures and listen away.
Well, thank you very much, Becca. I'm really excited to be a part of this, and thank you for organizing this, and thank you for everybody that's participating in this today. I'm actually going to be fairly brief because I think a lot has been said already, and I want you to know that we are showing these pictures because farm workers have been the invisible ones for decades, if not centuries, and you don't need to see my face, you need to see their faces and the work that they do. I got involved with this. Well, I've always been concerned about social justice ever since I was a little kid. And I worked for social justice organizations and was frustrated with social justice organizations that didn't really understand the environmental issues. I worked for environmental organizations who didn't really get the social justice work. And so I was a little frustrated by both. And then I discovered the Farm Worker Association of Florida, and that's where it's at. Because I also worked on Indigenous rights issues for a long time. And to me, farm worker issues bring it all together. Everybody's got to eat, and food is one of the most basic things there is. And we all depend on farm workers for our food. But working with farm workers brings together Indigenous rights issues, racial issues, justice issues, social justice issues, environmental justice, climate justice, and food justice and food security. So to me, this is exactly where I'm supposed to be. And I understand more and more all the time. I've been working with the Farm Worker Association for about 25 years, and I've worked on environmental justice issues and environmental issues for almost 40 years. So I'm old, but I just want to say that this is vitally important, and it's really important that we understand the deep systemic issues inside our entire system of agriculture that is the reason for the exploitation of our environment and people. The first quote unquote farm workers in the United States were enslaved peoples from Africa that worked on the plantations under slavery in the southeastern United States. They are one of the only workers that are excluded from labor laws, the National Labor Relations Act and the Fair Labor Standards that cover almost all other workers. And that is part of the history of racism in our entire system of agriculture that has been exploiting workers ever since. We have a racial reckoning in our country right now that people are finally recognizing that farm workers are the essential workers that they have always been, but they have been invisible until COVID kind of made them visible for a little while. But we have been depending on farm workers ever since enslaved the times of enslaved peoples until now. So it's really important to understand that. And that's why it means so much to me to work with farm workers, because through the Farm Worker Association and through the work that we do with the farm worker communities, we are getting at the real heart of capitalism, colonialism, and racism that are part of our system of agriculture and basically our system, worldwide, but specifically on our system of agriculture, where we see this exploitation of the environment through pesticides and fertilizers, and of the people and the communities. So that's where I come to this work from. And regarding community-based research, well, honestly, having worked with Indigenous communities for a while as well, sometimes I get frustrated with research. Why do we need research? Because we should know that pesticides are bad. We don't need chemical pesticides, but we have them. And we have this system of agriculture. We have this system where we are producing things that are bad for the environment, bad for our health. And so one way to be able to work on policy change to get better protections for farm workers and others is to conduct the research. The very first research project I was involved in with the Farm Worker Association started in 1996, 97. And that was an example of maybe a not quite so good research project. We did surveys with like 400 farm workers between Pearson, which is in Central Florida, for farm workers that worked in ferns and farm workers that worked in nurseries. And we were looking at neurological effects of farm work on farm workers, even though the researchers didn't want to say that because they couldn't use the word pesticide exposure. So that was kind of interesting. We did this, it was a huge project. We really engaged the community. And like Maria said, one of the reasons that we're able to do this is because people know the Farm Worker Association. Most all of our staff members come from farm worker families or were farm workers themselves. So we did this project, the first project with these researchers, and it took years to get the results from that project. And we would call the research and say, okay, so what's the results of this project we did? They would say, oh, well, we're not sure yet. We're still analyzing the data. And like 8 or 10 years later, I ran into the researcher at a conference and I said, what was the problem there? What took so long? And she said, basically, oh, that was our first project. We didn't really know what we were doing then. So they were cutting their teeth on working on their project with us. That's not cool, okay? That is not a good way to go about doing this. So what's really important is, and I want to thank Joan. Thank you for the kind words that you said, but Joan is an unsung hero because Joan really introduced us to Joe and to Emory University and to the University of Florida. And most of our research projects really resulted from Joan's relationship with researchers at other universities. So we are hugely indebted and grateful to Joan forever. And I want to sing her praises as part of this. So in engaging in these projects, because Joan had a good relationship with us, she knew who some of the good researchers were. And I just want to say that it's really important that you do have a good relationship with your team, because there is a long history of grassroots organizations being exploited by researchers. In fact, when I worked on Indigenous rights issues, there was Floyd Westerman was an American Indian, Native American singer who had a song about anthropologists, and it was not nice because oftentimes anthropologists will come into a community and do their research and then exploit communities for their own research and never give back to the communities. So a lot of grassroots organizations are very skeptical about working with academic institutions because a lot of times researchers will publish their research and never give back to the community. So we have been lucky to find great people to work with and that have given back to the community, and we're really grateful to that. I could talk for a long time, but I'm going to end there so we at least have a few minutes for questions and synthesis around this. And again, thank you very, very much. This is a great panel, and I'm indebted to everybody for this. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Jeannie. So, I'm hearing a lot kind of across all of your comments, and I do want to open it up to Ted and Rebecca as well as the folks that are gathering us all here over the series of the semester, maybe to frame out a closing question or some thoughts. But I think from my perspective, a couple of things that are sticking out across what all of you are talking about, both in specific projects as well as your own experiences, is everything in this work is very context specific. And so taking into account that context and dynamic is vitally important. And building relationships is important. And the same thing we do in our personal relationships, we should be doing in these relationships between universities and farm worker communities, or really any communities, which is making sure we're following up, we're following through, that we're, delivering on the things that we've committed to, and that we're not taking for granted the trust that we've been given kind of on both sides to work together, and the sorts of unique perspectives that everyone brings to the table. And so just so many themes, I think, across everything that you all shared. And I both value everything that you brought to the table around farm workers and their specific lived experiences. And I'm sure any of us would be would welcome people reaching out to talk with us about those things if you want to learn more about farm workers, but also the wisdom that you really distilled that we can utilize to think about and through the rest of the semester around how we can be working together more effectively and in a way that honors where everyone's coming from. So Ted and Rebecca, I want to turn it to you, because I feel like you always do such a good job of kind of like getting a question out, at least to kind of wrap us up and bring everything together. And I want to give you that opportunity to do it, because I know that the time is ticking too.
Well, I'm not quite ready to wrap us up. And to the extent that folks are willing to stay a bit over the hour, I want to encourage our panelists to do that. And also to remind the many folks who are listening in that, first of all, tonight's presentation has been recorded, will be archived, and will be available for you to take a look at in the future through the School of Public Policy website. There are a lot of amazing thoughts that have been put forward here. And the other thing I would just say, other two things, is that if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A, and we'll do the best that we can to get to those questions in the next few minutes. And I'll just make the observation that when you live in a place like Boston, you're really used to just going to a Whole Foods or Stop and Shop or some supermarket and seeing stacks of beautiful fruit or other produce, and we don't really think about how it gets there. Tonight's conversation underlines that supply chain that starts in the fields. But the other thing it does for us as researchers, I think, is to remind us that many of the communities that we need to work with most are essentially invisible to us. We're used to working with a nonprofit organization in an urban community that's been around for a while, that has leadership, that has a 501 status, all of that sort of stuff. But in fact, the groups we probably need to be working with most are those groups, such as what we've heard from tonight, that are largely invisible. And we have an obligation, I think, an ethical obligation to reach out beyond the groups we normally converse with, to provide the kind of support that we can to people who are so essential. But again, it's a reminder that if you have questions or comments, please get them into the chat or to the Q&A, and I'll turn this over to Rebecca.
Thank you, Ted. Thank you, Becca, Joan, Joe, Maria, Benita, and Jeannie. So much to digest. I know I'm going to be thinking about this for a long time, but just to build a little bit on something that Ted just said, working with invisible groups and that notion of humans being invisible, like what a horrifying image that is, right? That's a word that we can apply to our fellow human beings. And it strikes me that systems of oppression are really a function of power imbalances. People of different identities, different positions, one group being able to wield power over another in ways that are extractive. You know, Jeannie talked about we're extracting from the environment, we're extracting from human beings, we are taking. And the reason that we can do this, those protections are not in place because invisibility represents a lack of power, the power to have your voice heard, the power to fight back. But what I think is incredibly important is that all of you drew our attention to ways that we cannot reverse that. I mean, it's so deeply entrenched in our systems, but how do we begin? And a couple of mentions around capacity building, right? Instead of extracting, putting back, right? Building organizations' capacities, providing funding in the form of gift cards, recognizing that research can be extractive unless we flip that and we're conceptualizing as a way to perhaps bring some care and services and sharing that data so that we're not, we're not taking information and ideas and life stories away from people and not giving anything back. So what does that take? It takes these kinds of conversations. It takes the courage of people to call us out on that. And I'm wondering, if our goal here together is to affect change, if we could have any last thoughts from people around how do we reverse the invisibility? How do we build capacity? On the research side, I think it's on us to call each other in and raise awareness of this practice, but it's also to provide alternatives. And I would just love it if anybody has any thoughts. What is the call to action? What is the request for giving back instead of taking from that we can actualize a different way, visualize a different way of seeing people and bringing to rather than taking from? Any thoughts on that? Joe.
So thanks for that. I mean, I really appreciate this is all good, but we got to do something about it. And I really want to highlight something that I appreciate Ted saying, because over the course of the holidays, I took a long trip out west, and I had forgotten how big our country is and how much of it, you can just drive for hours and hours and not see a person or a cow, right? So we can sometimes get lost in our bubble. And I think the recognition of, all the things that we take for granted, and frankly, the things that we value, like I like getting my vegetables on sale. I like getting them from one store as opposed to another because they may be cheaper at one store as opposed to another, right? That all comes on somebody's back somewhere, right? Because at the end of the day, it's a vertically integrated industry that if we don't acknowledge that, if we don't give a face and a value to the back that any of those things that we as consumers oftentimes put value on, it's going to fall on somebody's back. And so therefore, one action step I think is the next time you go to the grocery store, ask yourself the question, are you selecting this lower priced option simply because it's convenient for you? And to what cost does that have to somebody somewhere? And clearly that's just an extension of the Fair Food Program that the Coalition of Mockley Workers has been working on for a while, but it's something that everybody can get involved in. And then the second piece that I would really like to throw out, and again, I think Joan and the work that the Farmworker Association has done for so long, is remembering that each one of those community partnerships usually involves training members of the community to do something. So even if they're not changing the community, you're at least changing and engaging in some professional development of people from the community. So you're always at least leaving some leaders behind that can kind of keep things going. I think those are two really important action steps as far as being able to press the needle forward.
I see we do have a question in the Q&A as well from Michael. I wonder if any of the researchers or community partners, I would add, might share examples of project outcomes that help the community And as a corollary, how can we discuss project outcomes with community members when those outcomes might be difficult to quantify or articulate at the start of the project? Any thoughts on that? And I see Jeannie, your hand is up, and please, Jeannie, go wherever you want with your answer, whether it's to follow up on Joe's thoughts or to respond to the one that I just read.
Well, I'm starting to write it in the chat, but I'll go ahead and say it. So one of the projects we did with Emory University was around reproductive health of farm worker women. And the result of that was we created a great training for women. It was a 3-hour-long training for farm worker women on heat stress, pesticide exposure, ergonomic stress, the development of the fetus, and where in the development of the fetus they were at most risk for pesticide exposure. It was a great training. We used popular education method. It was so much fun. It was interactive. The women all laughed. We would provide dinner for them, usually pizza or subs, sometimes Mexican food. And the training was just incredible, and women really learned a lot. It also built community while they were doing that. And so that was one. The project that we're working on with Joe, the PISCA project, we created 2 trainings out of that, one on pesticide exposure and one on heat stress. And we continue to do those trainings now. The TASK project that Joan mentioned, that's one of the first projects. We produced materials that could be put up in offices and in healthcare centers on washing your hand washing, the importance of hand washing to reduce pesticide exposure. And we also created a hand washing station that farm workers could use to protect themselves from pesticide exposure. And we also did community meetings, and we would bring back the results of the research to the community through community meetings, where we could do PowerPoint presentations, show them the results, and they could ask questions about it. And then we also use some of that to help empower farm workers to speak for themselves, to go make public testimony in like in Tallahassee for the heat stress bill that we're trying to get passed in Florida. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. So definitely examples from us to draw on. Ted, I would be happy to let people know what's coming next week. If you would like to summarize anything for us or bring us back on point, or shall I just go into that? All right. So you all know, if you've been here for a couple of weeks, that we've got this kind of ongoing theme throughout these conversations. We've been hearing some really interesting language, and I want to make sure that we call awareness to our own use of jargon sometimes, because I think that's part of what isolates us from each other, is the clicky words that we know what we're talking about, and others might not. And some of those that we have been using include participatory modeling, participatory action research, participatory community-based participatory research, et cetera, et cetera. Well, what does that actually mean? And how can we put a human face on that? Next week, we're going to have our colleague, Myra Zellner, who is a newish, about a couple years in, but she came during the pandemic, which makes it feel like she is still new, a professor of public policy and urban affairs, and also the director of participatory modeling and data sciences in the College of Social Sciences and Humanities. And Myra has been deeply involved in developing some tools that can make this the voice of communities more accessible, create more inclusive practices of research. And she's going to be bringing us a panel of folks to talk about that. So hopefully we can demystify some of this and remember to center people's voices, not our own jargon, and talking about the importance of centering voices as we do the work to make sure that we are holding true to the practices and principles that we're espousing throughout the semester. So thank you again to everybody who joined us tonight, to our tech team, and to Ted for giving us Open Classroom this semester for these really important conversations about power to the people. I hope we will see many of you again next week.
Thank you all for being here.